An Introduction to SQL Server 2005. Welcome everyone. We're going to start this series off with an introductory look at everything SQL Server 2005. Rather than just jump right in feet first, we're going to kind of mosey our way on in and get familiar with the product. So that's the goal of this video specifically, is to just kind of introduce you to everything SQL Server 2005, because a lot has changed since the last version, and it's been a while since we've got a new version. So we're going to start with a nice little overview of everything SQL Server 2005. I'll get you familiar with Microsoft's goals for this version of the product. We'll take a look at some facts. I'll show you kind of the network setup that we're going to be working with throughout this series. I'll also get you familiar with a timeline. I love doing timelines and introductions to products because it puts the product in perspective from birth to where we're at now to where we're going in the future. We'll then end our overview with a look at some of the new components and existing components, some of the changes to these components, and also the new tools that we're going to be using, because there are some major tool changes in this version. We'll then move into a tour. We'll take a big tour of some of these new tools, specifically the SQL Server Management Studio that we're going to be spending 99% of our time in this version of the product. So I'll get you familiar with that. I'll also get you familiar with the Start menu and some of the different changes inside of the Start menu. So with that, I welcome you to SQL Server 2005. It's here at last. It's been a long wait, but the wait is over. And I tell you something, the wait is actually going to be worth all of our whiles, because a lot has changed in this product. Microsoft has touched virtually every single little nook and cranny you can think of in SQL Server, and did something to it that'll make our lives easier in some form or fashion. And they did a very good job. SQL Server is here to play in the big leagues. So with that, I want to start off with just a look at some of Microsoft's goals, and actually one of their major goals for us, the DBAs and the developers of the world. And that major goal is integration. Tighter integration between the DBAs and the developers. And actually there's one more role that goes on here, and that would of course be our users. So this is going to become very apparent to you. Even when you just start navigating the Start menu and using some of these tools, you're already going to notice that there's a high level of integration going on between these roles. Now, the actual roles themselves, they're not going to change. The DBAs are still going to be managing, monitoring, and maintaining the health, performance, reliability, security, and stability of our systems. And the developers are still going to be building everything inside of these systems. That's not going to change. And of course, users, you're always going to be using the results from our hard efforts on both ends. But again, the roles aren't going to change. The roles and responsibilities, they're going to stay the same. What is going to happen, however, is, if you remember in the past, anything prior to SQL Server 2005, the DBAs, you always sat in SQL Enterprise Manager and the OSQL utility. You basically did all your administrative tasks through one tool. The developers, we always did our development tasks in a different tool, that of course being SQL Query Analyzer. Of course we use SQL Enterprise Manager here and there, but our main tool of choice was SQL Query Analyzer. And of course the DBAs was SQL Enterprise Manager. Well, come down to now, and guess what? That's gone. SQL Server, or SQL Enterprise Manager, SQL Query Analyzer, they're gone. They have been integrated into one product called SQL Server Management Studio. And of course, this doesn't mean we're going to be holding hands with our developers and our DBAs, but what we are going to be doing is talking the same language, because we're going to be using the same tools and technologies to do our jobs. So what does that mean? Of course, that means better productivity. Us speaking the same language is a good thing, and you know, we're probably going to be a little more social towards each other now too. And just to give you a little background on myself, I've actually been on both sides of this wall in the past. I've been a DBA, I've held jobs as a developer, and now I'm actually both. I'm a DBA in the morning, a developer in the afternoon, and a trainer at night. What do you know? So I'm both very honored and pleased to have the opportunity to do this series, and I hopefully can provide some great insight from both sides of this now non-existent wall. And a couple other things I want to mention about SQL Server 2005 is that it is breaking all of the records for benchmark testing and performance testing. Just to give you an example, there was a benchmark test done pretty recently, pretty much around the time SQL Server was released, maybe a little bit before then, where they took Oracle 10G, one of the latest versions of Oracle, and SQL Server 2005, and ran a couple of benchmark tests against it. Well, the first thing that happened was, of course, SQL Server for the first time broke 1 million transactions per minute. And that's a big thing in the database industry. That is a huge milestone, because basically what that says is SQL Server is ready to play with the big boys. And I remember getting into SQL Server right around the time 6.0 was released in 95, and going all the way up to 2000, I always felt like those Oracle guys were superior to us. because they always boasted that Oracle did this and did that, and SQL Server could never do this, and it will never do that. Well, that's all changed, of course, and what this benchmark proved, and this benchmark was done on an HP supercomputer with 64 Intel Itanium 2 processors, and it turned out SQL Server blew Oracle away. In fact, it has 7% performance increase over Oracle 10G, and it had a 37% lower cost. What does that mean? That basically means, and all the CFOs, CIOs, and CEOs of the world are going to love this. You can throw this one at them. You get more bang for your buck. That's all that means. And it also means that Oracle better keep an eye on that market share, because we may have a new industry standard in town before long, right? We'll see. All right, so let's take a look at our network here. Inside of the CBT Nuggets domain, we have behind our firewall, in that famed DMZ area, we have a cluster of servers. We have VB Nugget, SQL Nugget, and Web Nugget. And these are the servers that we're going to be working with throughout the series. Let me put a little dot here because when you're in a mall and you see a little dot UR here, yeah, that's what VB Nugget is. UR here. We're going to be sitting on VB Nugget, and this is kind of our test little area, our development. This is where we have our .NET language installed. We have pretty much every copy of SQL Server you can think of here. We have a SQL 2000 instance, and I call it SQL 2000 Test is actually the name of it. We also have a SQL Express instance, and we are going to be installing, that is not on here yet, but we will when we get into an installation video, a SQL 2005 test instance. So I like to give the developers, of course, being a developer, you like to have everything. Give them everything. The more resources our developer have, the more they can develop for, the more prepared they'll be, all that good stuff. So we'll put everything on our VB Nugget machine. Our SQL Nugget machine is going to be our database server. So on here we'll create a SQL 2005 prod instance for our production instance of SQL 2005, and we'll have a SQL 2005 dev instance. So that's our main database server. That's what we'll be hitting up most of the time for running our queries and doing our demos and our tests and everything that we're going to learn about in SQL 2005. And then finally we have Web Nugget, where we don't have any instances of SQL installed. It's just simply our IIS server, our web server, in case we need to do anything web-oriented while we're over here in our VB Nugget server. It's there just in case we do. Alright, so once again, welcome to SQL Server 2005. We're going to have a ton of fun and we're going to learn a lot. So let's jump right into a timeline. And again, I love to give timelines in the beginning when you're introducing a product, simply because it puts it into perspective. It puts it in kind of a life cycle perspective as to when it was initially concepted to pretty much now, current day, and of course where we're going. I'll even give you the code name of the next version of SQL Server. So this timeline actually takes just Microsoft's versions of SQL Server into account. What happened though, I'll give you the lowdown on previous 1993. In 1987, a little company called Sybase created something called Sybase SQL Server. And they created it for Unix, specifically for Unix. Well, about the time 1988 rolled around, Microsoft said, you know what, Oracle's the only one out there. They're on the top of the food chain as far as database servers go. We need to partner with somebody and get a product out there up and running so we can compete with these guys. And that's exactly what they did. They teamed up with Sybase and also another company called Ashton Tate, and they all co-developed pretty much the next 3 versions of SQL Server, which was still called Sybase SQL Server at the time. Well, 1993 rolled around and Microsoft, got a little bigger. Windows NT was out about that time, and that's exactly what they wanted to do. They wanted to create a database platform that was integrated with their Windows NT operating system. So Sybase still co-developed this with them, and most of the code base was Sybase at this point. And really what they did, they just ported one of their Unix versions, which was Sybase SQL 4.0, Sybase SQL Server 4.0. They just simply ported it over to a Windows NT. So shortly after 4.21 was released, Microsoft and Sybase decided to go their separate ways, and that's exactly what they did. Microsoft, again, wanted better integration with Windows NT, so what they did was they came out with their first little GUI, pretty much the first user interface version of SQL Server. 6.0 came out in 1995, built for Windows NT 3.51. Again, it did have some GUI aspects to it. It wasn't very pretty, but it was GUI. Of course, nothing was very pretty in 3.1 and 3.51, but it worked. And again, this version was actually still, the majority of the code base was Sybase written code, but Microsoft was working on that slowly, getting it out of Sybase code, putting it into their own code base, and reworking the product all the different components of it, and they introduced replication in this version as well. Now, around the same time that 6.0 came out, Sybase released their last version of what was coined SQL Server, Sybase SQL Server, which was 11.0 at the time. And just after that, they changed their next version, which was 11.5, to something called Sybase Adaptive Server Enterprise, just to avoid confusion. So Microsoft, not 10 months after releasing 6.0, released 6.5. And if any of you are familiar with 6.5, of course, it was a little better on the GUI as well, the interface, and this was released for Windows NT 4.0, but it was horrible on performance. It did very poorly on all the benchmarks, but there was a lot of new features and enhancements as far as what SQL Server can do, so they were working towards it. Well, around 99, 7.0 came out, and this was a major reworking of the SQL Server. They redid 100% of the code, everything. There was nothing in Sybase at this point, all Microsoft code. They did a new GUI, rebuilt it from the ground up, as I said, introduced OLAP and data warehousing. It was fast, robust, scalable, much better and much easier to use, and it was very highly adopted throughout the database industry. 2000 came out, not too long after 7.0, and it was another a very, very nice upgrade. Many features and enhancements. You'll notice a similarity here between 6.0 and 6.5. They were released pretty close, just enhancements and features. Same thing with 7.0 and 2000. Just kind of just a little upgrade with some new features, enhancements. We got DTS, for instance. We got analysis services. And really under the hood, this was version 8.0. And you're going to see a trend here. Look at this. After we got a new version and upgrade, check it out. We got another new version. And this one, again, pretty much everything in SQL Server, every tool, every component, there isn't a thing that hasn't been touched in this version. Everything has been touched, upgraded, enhanced. You name it, it's been done. We have a whole new suite of development and management tools. We have reporting. Hey, lots of reporting. Service Broker, which is pretty much the new Microsoft message queue. You'll notice that's kind of gone away. This is a new message queuing system. Of course, that message queues should be integrated into a database environment, and we'll get into that. We have a whole video on that. And of course, internally, version 9.0. And the next version that's coming out is actually called Katmai, currently codenamed Katmai. And we haven't had no release dates, no time frames on this, but we know it'll be out probably a lot sooner than 2005 came out. And just another little interesting note on 2005, it was actually in development for nearly a decade. That's a long time. So that's our timeline on SQL Server, pretty much since it was born back in 1988 in Sybase's hands. Now it's in Microsoft's hands, and it's a beautiful product. It's evolving nicely. Now let's take a look at some of the tools and components of this new version. And again, you hear me talking about this integration, new tools. Well, Microsoft had to do pretty much a lot. They had to redefine their entire set of tools in order to accomplish these integration goals that they had. So what they did was just that. They pretty much redefined, rewrote, and restructured everything as far as tools go. We no longer have a SQL Server Query Analyzer. We no longer have a SQL Server Enterprise Manager. We have one combined tool, both in the development and the management side, called SQL Server Management Studio, SSMS. This is where we're going to be spending most of our time. DBAs or a developer, it doesn't matter who you are, we're going to be in this, we're going to be learning this quite a bit. And let me tell you, from experience, at first you're going to be a little iffy on this because it is so different. But once you get into it, you realize, you know what, it's not that different. And it's really cool because there are some very, very nice productivity features rolled into this new environment that's going to make our lives a lot easier and a lot more managed, and again, of course, tightly integrated. We also have on the management side SQL Server Configuration Manager, and what SSCM here replaces is this is going to replace all of your client network utility, your server network utility, the service manager. And just to kind of show you here, I do have SQL Server 2000 installed. So if I go to Start Programs up to Microsoft SQL Server, this is 2000 in here, here's 2005, and I actually don't have the 2005 database server installed, but since I have SQL Server Express installed, I have the tools. So SQL Server, the regular version, look at this, we had server network utility, we had client network utility, we have service manager. All of these three components are now wrapped in to one single tool called the SQL Server Configuration Manager. And again, I'll go through the SQL Server 2005 tools when we do our tour. So I'm going to show you all these here very shortly. I just want to get you familiar with them first. On the development side, we have something called Business Intelligence Development Studio, otherwise known as BIDS. And BIDS is where we're going to do all of our If you remember DTS, if you're a DTS fan, I'm actually a huge DTS fan. I've been using it since it was born in SQL Server 2000, SQL Server 7.0, and I absolutely loved it. And this is what BIDS is for. It allows us to create our new, what's called no longer DTS, but SQL Server Integration Services, SSIS. This is where we can create those packages. This is where we're going to do all of our reporting development. This is where we're going to do our analysis services if we're into analysis services, data warehousing, creating cubes and MDX queries and all that good stuff, dimensions. I could go on and on. But essentially, this is the new development environment. So we're not going to use SSMS to create our DTS or now our SSIS packages or our reports. We're going to use BIDS to do that. We also have some performance tools. We have the Database Engine Tuning Advisor, which we'll go through that when we talk about performance. Basically, is a very, very smart tool that allows us to dissect everything about our database. We also have, or databases for that matter, or database server. We also have the SQL Server Profiler, and this is just like the old profiler, except we have some new things we can do with it, some very cool things. And again, we have videos dedicated to performance. So we'll talk about analyzing statistics, monitoring the health of a server and the performance, and all that good stuff when we get into those. But just note that we do have a new performance tool here, and of course our existing performance tool has been upgraded. So these are the major tools that we're going to be using in our everyday adventures inside of our SQL Server 2005 instances and our job responsibilities. And let me tell you, they're a lot of fun, and we're gonna be learning all about all of these. We'll get into every single one of these tools and use them. I'll get you familiar with them. We'll have a good time with them. Now, there's also, you notice I didn't mention any of the command line tools, such as we have a brand new one actually called sql-cmd, SQL Command. And really what this is, it's the command line version, the command line interface of SSMS, SQL Server Management Studio, and it replaces OSQL. OSQL completely gone, no more. So a lot of cool things. We'll touch on SQL Command as well. Another thing is the APIs for the programmers out there and even the database administrators. In the past, we had what was called SQL DMO, SQL Distributed Management Objects, and all this was basically the library that the object library for everything in SQL Server. SQL Server 7 and 2000 had SQL DMO. We got rid of this. It's now called SMO, just SMO, SQL Management Objects, and this is the entire object library for SQL Server 2005. So those are the APIs, the API then, the API now. Some of the different components that we're going to be working with. We have, of course, the database engine. This, same as the old database engine, it's changed, of course, a lot internally. A lot more we can do with it, which we'll get into and take a look at when we get into Management Studio, but it's still the old database engine. Analysis services, this hasn't changed much. We still have analysis services for developing our multidimensional data, developing a look at our multidimensional data. We can do more with analysis services too. We can create dimensions on our cube, something we couldn't really do in the past, and a lot more as well. We also have SQL Server Integration Services, one of my favorite things, and this is really, really DTS and SQL Server 7 and 2000. I've used it so much. I can tell you some of the crazy things I've done with it. I've taken it past its limits and then some, but it was quirky. DTS was always kind of quirky. There were always some things that you couldn't do that you had to go through extreme measures using VBScript to end up doing. SQL Server Integration Services, wow, what an incredible step forward. This is just, it's light years ahead of DTS. Let me tell you, there are some really, really cool things we can do with this. And we also have a video dedicated to integration services, so we'll get into that. And basically what integration services is, if you're not familiar with it, it's SQL Server's ETL tool. We also have SQL Server reporting services. And reports, again, another one of my favorite things. I've actually developed a couple of reporting systems in SQL Server using SQL Server reporting services. Only it actually came out a couple years ago, about a year and a half ago actually, in late 2004, early 2005, the beta came out for SQL Server 2000. It was SQL Server Reporting Services on SQL 2000, and I've been using it since then. Again, it was a little buggy. There were some bugs, there were some limitations with it, but it has grown up as well, and I am just overwhelmed with some of the things that reporting services can do. And you'll actually see reporting services in action when we're in SSMS, because SQL Server, of course, utilizes its own services and provides us with some pretty detailed and very interesting, very cool reports at the server level, the database level. Very interesting stuff that I'll show you. But reporting services, a very welcome addition. Of course, reports are just something that every user, everybody wants reports, right? Reports are awesome. That's all I'll say about them. They are awesome. And they did a really good job with it because they are so easy to develop, use, and manage. All perspectives, all sides. I love reporting services. Can't say enough about it, so I'll stop. SQL Server notification services. This is really cool too because notification services basically allows us to send anything in any format to any platform. That's pretty much the goal of notification services, and we'll get into it. We have another video dedicated to notification services, so we'll take a look at how we work with notification services. We can send text-based messages, email messages, you name it. We can send pretty much anything through notification services to anybody on any device. Very, very cool. And of course, the SQL Server Service Broker, I talked about this a little bit. It's the new message queuing system. You can treat Service Broker like, pretty much think of it as if you have a lot of different layers, a lot of different parties, a lot of different components all interacting, you can't do it all in real time, right? So we need some broker in the middle to manage the different application boundaries within our processes or within our applications. So that's what the Service Broker allows us to do. It's basically, if you're familiar with Microsoft Message Queue at all, which is, again, it was its own little standalone product that came with Windows NT in the past. It was a little kind of a separate add-on that you had to install. It was a message queuing system. It allowed you to queue up messages and other applications to come and get and peek at those messages, take those messages off that server to use them. So it's just kind of a queuing system to store things in the middle. And we're going to pretty much learn about everything you see on this slide. The only one we're not going to get in-depth on is the SQL Server Analysis Services, simply because analysis services, data warehousing, data modeling, dimensional data really does deserve an entire series on itself because there's a lot to it. So, enough of the slide stuff. How about we take a tour? And let's start off with a tour of the Start menu to see what's changed. So we'll head on down to the Start button here, drag on up to Programs, and you can see I have two Microsoft SQL Server menu groups here. And the first menu group is, of course, SQL Server 2000. This should look familiar to you if you're familiar with SQL Server 2000, of course. You can run them simultaneously on the same machine. I haven't had any problems, and I've been doing it for well over a year now. Even with the betas, I've been running them on the same machine. No problems at all. So that's good news right off the bat there. But things that have changed, you'll see the entire Start menu has been reworked. And as you can see here, going from top to bottom, we have analysis services. This just is simply a deployment wizard. You're going to still create your analysis services packages inside of SQL Server Business Intelligence Development Studio, the BIDS tool that I was talking about. Configuration tools. This is where, if we go, let me go back up to SQL Server 2000 here. Most of these items in here, the Service Manager, the Server Network Utility, the Client Network Utility, these are our main management items for configuring the server. Well, those have all been wrapped into this one tool right here called SQL Server Configuration Manager. So this is where you'll be spending most of your time to do things like managing the services and managing how clients connect and how the server allows connections into SQL Server. We also have Notification Services Command Prompt. This is, again, if we want to do any sort of management or automation or monitoring of our notification services, we'll do it in here. Reporting Services Configuration. This is how we'll actually configure the reporting services server instances. If you have more than one instance installed, then you just select an instance and off you go, configuring the reporting services. And there's actually a couple of areas of management in reporting services. There's, of course, managing the reports and everything that goes along with the reports and how you access them through IIS and all that good stuff. That's not managed through here. Again, this is kind of the configuration area of setting up your report server. So we'll get into that when we talk about reporting services. Again, just talked about Configuration Manager. SQL Server Error and Usage Reporting. This is just simply, I'm going to click on it just to show you here quick. You're going to get this, and I'm going to go through this when we install SQL Server 2005, but they ask you, do you want to send error reports when something happens? It's just basically, do you want to be connected to Microsoft when anything happens to give them the data about when something went wrong so they can, of course, better prepare them for the next version. And that's all this is. So nothing really big there. Going back into our Start menu here, into our configuration tools, you also have a SQL Server Surface Area Configuration. This will just basically run some security checks and also allow for better performance. It'll basically scan all the components in SQL Server, see the ones that are in use, ones that aren't in use, and try to block off the ones that aren't in use to, again, prevent security flaws and security holes in your system. So we'll use these tools when the time comes. We also have documentation and tutorials. This is just where the upgraded SQL Server Books Online is, and there's also some tutorials in here on the mobile edition and just standard tutorials for everything you can think about in SQL Server. There's also performance tools, and we're going to be using these quite a bit when we get into our monitoring activity and dealing with performance and troubleshooting issues. We'll talk about the Database Engine Tuning Advisor, a very, very slick tool, and also the SQL Server Profiler, one of my favorite tools in SQL Server because it does allow you to get into the conversation between your clients, your applications, and SQL Server. It allows you to kind of dissect that application. A great troubleshooting tool. I live by this, let me tell you. Most developers should live by this because it's a wonderful thing. Oop. Back up into here, our SQL Server Business Intelligence Development Studio. This is BIDS that I was talking about, where again we'll be creating all of our reports, our analysis service packages, our SQL Server integration service packages, and we'll get on this when the time comes. And then the big one, SQL Server Management Studio. This is where we're going to be spending 90% of our time. This is pretty much SQL Server Query Analyzer and SQL Server Enterprise Manager from SQL Server 2000 rolled up into one brand new tool. And I'm going to go ahead and click on this, open it up for us, because we're going to take a little tour of SQL Server Management Studio, SSMS. So this is what you'll get the first time you fire up SSMS and every time you fire up SSMS, unless you tell it not to. But essentially, this is just a connection dialog box. And this is all it's asking us is, hey, do you want to quickly connect to a server out there in case you want to run any queries against it? And you can actually hit cancel here. And basically what we get then is a disconnected environment. So in the past, in SQL Query Analyzer, you always had to connect to something, even to just write queries. You always had to have a constant connection to the server. Well, now we don't. If I go to File, New, Database Engine Query, and then it's going to ask me again, do I want to connect? I'm just going to say cancel here. Look at this. I can now write queries, anything I want in here, without being connected. How cool is that? And if I do want to connect and run this query, test out my query, I can just hit execute, and it'll ask me, it'll pop open with that same dialog box here. I hit connect, and boom. And what it's doing is, you notice, I'm not really connected to anything still. It's just that this query has a connection if we need it. So if we hit execute here, it's actually going to go ahead and connect on the fly, run the query, and then disconnect on the fly. So we're not actually holding a constant connection to the database. Something that's very, very neat, and something we could never do before. But really what we're going to end up doing here, I'm just going to close out of this query, is you're most likely, like we did in SQL Server 2000, we're going to register our servers. And then if we need to do anything with those servers, write queries against them, manage them, whatever we're going to do, we're going to connect to them through our registered servers, and that'll give us a connection inside of our Object Explorer. Let me give you an example here. Let me go ahead and open up SQL Server 2000 and do some comparisons by going down to Start, Programs, on over to Microsoft SQL Server, and into Enterprise Manager. So here's the old way of doing things. We always had we would register our servers, and then we'd connect to that registered instance to work with, of course, all the objects inside of this instance. So this is, again, a local copy of SQL 2000 I have registered here, VB-NUGGET /SQL 2000 test. And there we go. So we get our connection, and we go ahead and work with our respective objects if we were to manage our database server. So it's just a little bit different over here in SSMS because what we have, again, is our area that we can manage our registered servers, and then we have our area where we can manage our current connections to those registered servers called Object Explorer. So let me just go ahead and do this. Let's go ahead and register a server here. I'm going to right-click, choose New, SQL Server Registration, and basically it's the same dialog box as before, very similar. It's just what server are you connecting to? We'll connect to our sql_NUGGET /SQL 2005 prod instance, production instance here. You can click on Test, boom, successful, and save. There we go. Now we have a registered server. And before, over in SQL 2000, before this kind of green arrow showed us that we were connected. Well, now this green arrow is showing us that the server is up and running. So we do not actually have a connection to the server currently. In order to do that, you have to right-click on it, choose Connect, and we can do two things. We can create a new ad hoc query, or we can say, yep, give me a connection to Object Explorer. And now we can come in here and pretty much view everything that we were looking at in SQL 2000, all of our respective areas within our database server. So we can manage our databases, we can manage security, server objects, replication, anything you see in here. So up top is where we're going to manage our instances and our actually registered servers, and the bottom is where we're going to manage our connections to those registered servers so we can work with our objects. Let me show you something really cool that you can do as well in here. If you click on a database, you're going to notice this Reports button is going to light up, and if you drop down the Reports button, look at all these reports built into each database by default. And let me just go ahead and click on one. How about disk usage there? This will run out and grab all the statistics for this database. Very intuitive. This is actually using reporting services to gather this information. Let me go ahead and hide our tabs here so we can see a little more of this. And that's another cool thing. If you've ever worked with Visual Studio, it's got a very intuitive environment. It's very, very good at saving you screen real estate because, of course, we all need that being developers and administrators. We need our screen space. So this whole idea of floating windows, you can pin them down. That's all I did here is click on the pin to pin them down. You can hold your mouse over them to bring them back out and then pin them down again if you'd like to. But I'm actually going to go ahead and unpin them so they kind of suck over to the side here. and we get more screen real estate to work with. So look at this little report. Back to our report here. So this is actually a disk usage report, and this is very, very detailed. Watch this. If I go down here, you're going to see we have some drill down sub-reports. And inside of each one of these drill downs, there is a lot of data. Data from every table, every record, and all the basically every little leaf and segment and anything you can think about as far as storage goes is showed inside of this report. And it gets very, very detailed. You can get down to the partition level and get just really, really detailed on memory usage. Again, how much data is on each partition within our index nodes. Very, very, very slick stuff. So we can never have too much data, of course, especially when we're troubleshooting. The more data we have, the more resources we have to troubleshoot, right? And that's exactly what they're doing here. They're giving us a lot of data. So a lot of data about our database and every single object in our database and everything that's going on with our database. So we'll be using these reports if we need to do any troubleshooting. Just some kind of slick that I wanted to show you there. I'll also pin down these windows. There's another really neat thing inside of this environment, and that is something called Solution Explorer. And again, if you're familiar with the Visual Studio world, solutions hold projects. And of course, projects hold files related to whatever you're building. Let me give you an example. I'm going to close out of our summary window here and kind of give us a little more room to work with. I'm going to go ahead and choose File, New, Project. And it's going to say, all right, what kind of project would you like to create? And let's just go ahead and stick with our default project name here. Click OK. And that's going to go ahead and create us a solution with a project inside of it. So there's not much you can do here other than, of course, we could rename our solution here. We could add more projects underneath our solution. That's pretty much the top level object here is a solution. You can see you can add a new project, add an existing project, or rename. That's pretty much all you can do at the solution level. At the project level, we can add connections, we can add queries, we can add just support files. Pretty much any file you can think of you can put inside of this miscellaneous area. And you can see there's not much you can do here either except add files, add existing item, new connection, or new query. This will go in a miscellaneous, this will go in a new connection, this will go in a new query. Basically what this is for is to help us get better organized, because how many of us have random queries lying around in text files scattered about our hard drive? Yep, I'm one of them. I've got them absolutely everywhere. So that's what this is for, helping us get better organized. We can now structure our queries, our connections, everything about a specific task that you're working on or project. We can now organize it. Another really cool thing, another really neat feature with this whole solution area is if you happen to have a SourceSafe server lying around, yes, we can now put our projects into SourceSafe and our queries and everything about our solutions and our projects. We can store them in a SourceSafe server, so we now have source control over everything that we do. Very, very nice. I love that feature. Because I can't tell you how many times I've lost a hard drive and then, oh, guess what? All of my queries are gone. I have to start from scratch. So that's happened many, many times to myself. I'm sure you too. So now with SourceSafe, that'll never happen again. So how do we run queries with this thing anyway? Well, why don't I show you here? I'm going to go ahead and hide our Solution Explorer. I'll hide our registered servers. And running queries is very simple. You can do a couple of things. Actually, let me just mention one thing quick. This AdventureWorks database, this is what we're going to be working with throughout the series for our demos and examples and such, simply because it's the sample database that comes with SQL Server 2005, and I'll show you how to install it once we get to an installation video. But if you were familiar with SQL 2000, then you know the pubs in the Northwind database were the samples back then. They're gone. Now we just simply have AdventureWorks. And AdventureWorks DW is the data warehouse version, so we're pretty much just going to stick with this AdventureWorks database. And if we feel like running a query against it, what we would do, simply right-click on it, choose New Query, and boom. There we go. Now we can start writing our query in here, and we're ready to rock and roll. So how about we select everything from human resources .employee. And up here is our toolbar. This is, if you were familiar with Query Analyzer, this is the Query Analyzer toolbar. We can simply disconnect, or we can change the connection if we'd like to a different server, a different database. If you want, you're not bound to this database. When we created this query, we're not specifically bound at all. It just simply set it up so we're running it against this database. But you can switch it right in here, no problem. If you like switching databases to run this query against. And then you have your standard execute if you want to execute the query, and I'll go ahead and click on that. Boom. Here's our results. Our executed query, here's all the return data. This is pretty much the same as Query Analyzer data grid. It's just a grid of all the data that from the results of our query. And then there's a lot of other neat buttons that we'll go through when the time comes in working with specifically SQL Server Management Studio and all of our queries. But just another cool one you can do, you can automatically comment out and uncomment out your code, something you couldn't do in the past. So very, very handy. There's a lot of really cool features. I could go on and on forever about some of the cool things that we're going to be working with and learning about in SQL Server Management Studio. But again, I just kind of wanted to give you a brief tour here to start out to get you familiar with all the different areas inside of SQL Server Management Studio. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop this tour. And hopefully that gives you a good insight as to the tools that we're going to be using, all the different windows that we're going to be working with and panes that we're going to be working with inside of this brand new tool called SQL Server Management Studio. So in the CBT Nugget, we got familiar with an introduction to SQL Server 2005. Really what I wanted to do is get an introductory video out here just to get everyone's feet wet with some of the new changes, because there are a lot of changes in this version, and also Microsoft's design goals. And you can see just by changing the product and integrating the product, they basically took all the DBAs and all the developers and integrated us, kind of glued us together, so we're using the same tools to do our jobs. And of course, that's going to mean better productivity out of all us. We're going to become better friends with each other, and there's nothing wrong with that. So after that, we took a look at a timeline. I got you familiar with, of course, the beginning of SQL Server and the Sybase days all the way up to SQL Server 2005 and the future of SQL Server. And we took a look at some of the tools and all the new tools that we're going to be working with. There's a lot of new ones. Again, the whole start menu has been restructured. And of course, there's a lot of new components too. Integration services, reporting services, notification services, service brokering, and we'll get into all of that stuff in their respective videos. And at the end here, I took you through a tour. We took a tour of the Start menu, and then we took a tour of SQL Server Management Studio, our brand new tool that we're going to be using in our everyday jobs to get our tasks done. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I thank you for viewing.